This presentation is going to compare two sets of laws that occurred in two very different parts of the world. One in the Western Hemisphere, being in the United States, and one in the Eastern Hemisphere, occurring in Australia. Even though the United States and Australia were in two very separate parts of the world, the laws that applied to both of them at around the same time could not be more similar. They were effects of waves of migrants coming into many different countries from poorer parts of the world, the rising wave of nationalism that was sweeping the world, as well as this wave of imperialism, people conquering others. One of the things that all of these led to was a fear of outside groups, different ethnic groups known as, particularly in this presentation, the Chinese. So we're going to focus on this racism that developed amongst this group of migrant workers. But hopefully you'll see some similarities to modern day debates about immigrants and feelings and sentiments that are growing globally, not just in the United States, about immigrants and their presence in certain countries. Don't worry about this slide. This was from when I gave this presentation in two different parts, in two different flipped lessons. So don't worry about this slide. Just proceed to the next one. The first law that we're going to address is an American policy known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it's exactly what it is. The exclusion of Chinese that were coming into America. This slide shows you, before we get into what the Chinese Exclusion Acts explicitly stated, are some images of propaganda posters and advertisements that were in favor of or pro the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Something that maybe you should draw your attention to is not necessarily symbolism, as we often look at when we see visual images, but also some literary elements. Are there things that the authors of these posters were doing that were meant to invoke certain feelings or emotions among the reader? Think about that when you look at sizing of fonts, okay, as well as the use of punctuation and how they were using this as a way to show their sentiment about this group of people and to spread their propaganda. Why were Americans so anti-Chinese? That's often a question that I get. In the late 1800s, there were lots of immigrants that were coming into the United States. You had Irish, Germans, Italian, Poles. So why specifically were the Chinese targeted as a specific group of people that was going to be excluded? Well, part of it has to do with money. In 1849, there was the discovery of gold in the Western territory, I guess you could say, or state of California. During this time, a lot of people, Americans included, were rushing, hence the gold rush, to California in search of this gold. Among those that were coming in to the west coast of the United States were the Chinese. While most immigrants were coming to the East Coast via, you might have heard of the immigration station Ellis Island, most Chinese came in on the West Coast because obviously that is closest to where China is. You cross the Pacific Ocean and that's where you went. So most Chinese did not come in through Ellis Island. Most of them were coming in through the West Coast. And with the discovery of gold, that is what was luring a lot of Chinese to California. Not only that, because there was this group of migrant laborers, indentured laborers, as you could, think of them as, they were being used on the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, the Transcontinental Railroad was this new invention where we were going to connect the United States coast to coast. And the Chinese were instrumental in developing that railway, especially on the western connections. So you already had this use for these Chinese laborers, add this desire for gold, and you've got this mixture here that's going to explode a little bit. So what caused it to explode? You have competition. Competition over who was going to access this gold. Many Americans felt that the Chinese should not be allowed to go to California and capitalize on the gold rush. Because a lot of the Chinese then were expelled from their mines, because a lot of them were just working in the mines in general, many of them were driven away from those mines so that the Americans could access those mines and get the gold and prevent the Chinese from obtaining it. It was this idea of nationalism, that the Chinese are foreigners and that the Americans should be the ones accessing that commodity. As a result, communities were formed among the Chinese. Even today in downtown Chicago, there is Chinatown. The first ever Chinatown was developed in the city of San Francisco, but this was the beginning of ethnic boroughs, or ethnic centers within cities, where groups of people from a specific ethnic group all tended to congregate and hang out. You have Polish sectors, you have Jewish sectors, you have Greek sectors. They exist even today, but this is actually the origins of that. So because the Chinese were being kicked out of their mining jobs so that they couldn't steal the gold from the Americans, the Chinese had no other option other than to go to cities looking for work. So as a result, you're going to have these Chinese communities that form. And unfortunately, the Chinese could only keep low-wage jobs, particularly doing restaurant work and laundry work. So it was a way to keep the Chinese in low-wage, unskilled labor and to prevent them from obtaining this wealth that the Americans at the time felt was designated for them. So in 1882, at the height of the waves of immigrants that were coming into the United States Congress passed a law that actually suspended the amount of Chinese immigrants from entering the United States. Even though it was meant to only last for about 10 years, it lasted much longer. To that, as you can see, it was in place until 1943. And essentially what it did was it not only banned unskilled laborers, which kind of makes sense. We would only want to have skilled workers coming into the United States, but it also banned those that did possess some sort of artisan type skill. So whether you were skilled or unskilled, both were banned from entering the United States. They were also prevented from becoming citizens. So any Chinese immigrants that were already living in the United States at the time were not allowed to obtain a path to citizenship. They were supposed to remain as permanent immigrants. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Acts wasn't as exclusionary as you may think. In fact, as you can see here, many of them were actually able to come into the United States, but they needed to have permission from China, and they had to show that they were qualified, meaning that the skills that they possessed were beyond what was considered skilled, meaning like, say, a shoemaker or a butcher or a blacksmith. You had to produce some sort of a skill or some sort of a product that was above that type of a skill, which, as you can see here, very difficult to prove. Most people in China, which at the time we already know, China has essentially shut themselves down from most technology and have isolated themselves. So they're behind the times when it comes to technological development. So basically, this prevents anyone from being able to enter the United States because there's no amount of skill that the Chinese could possibly have that would be deemed acceptable by American standards. So here we have a political cartoon that addresses the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Something for you to think about. What position does this author take? Are they pro the Exclusion Acts or anti the Exclusion Acts? Thinking about some literary elements, is there some symbolism in this political cartoon that could be used to help you determine, say, the point of view of the author? Also think about stereotypes. Stereotypes are an unfortunate way of life. And stereotypes persist even today about a lot of ethnic groups. Are there any present in this political cartoon? Something for you to think about. The next policy that we're going to address is a British policy that applied to the continent of Australia. Because as you know, Australia was a colony of the British Empire. So what we're going to do is see how the White Australia policy compares to the Chinese Exclusion Acts. This slide shows a propaganda poster for the White Australia policy. Now, while you don't know what the White Australia policy is, I bet you can kind of figure it out by its name. Something for you to think about when looking at this poster, okay, is what is the point of view of the author? Are they in favor of a White Australia? Anti a White Australia? What about some symbolism? There's a ton in this propaganda poster. Something for you to think about. Almost exactly mirroring the cause for the Chinese Exclusion Acts were issues that were plaguing the British Empire regarding Australia. For example, in just about 2 to 3 years after gold was discovered in California, guess what was discovered in Australia? Gold in 1851. And that actually spurred a lot of the Chinese immigration. So this is, I guess, a slight difference, but also a similarity. It's a difference in that the gold is what lured the Chinese to Australia. Gold did not lure Chinese to America. The Chinese migrants were already there on the Transcontinental Railroad. But the gold was an added incentive, I guess you could say. So slight difference, but basically the main idea is gold is what is luring these Chinese to certain parts of the world in an effort, I guess you could say, to try to better their situation. One of the shocking differences is that roughly 50,000 Chinese came to Australia. Now that happened in a very short amount of time. There were equal amounts of the Chinese in the United States, but they came over in waves. This was an almost immediate influx of approximately 50,000 Chinese. So it definitely sparked some intense feelings. And as you can see, there was some rioting that occurred among the British citizens that were living in the colony of Australia. As we mentioned in chapter 17, the sugar industry and any type of cash crop farming is going to lead to the need for workers. Okay? And since Australia was in this tropical climate, they had lots of plantations that lured in a lot of the Chinese. So while they came for the gold, they stayed to work on the plantations. Similar to the United States, they came for work on the Transcontinental Railroad, but stayed for the gold. So it's a little inverted, but nonetheless pretty similar. Okay? One of the differences is, again, there's a lot of rioting and protests. Why? Because a new group of people started to come in as well. They were influenced by the Chinese. So now you're going to have a lot of islander groups from different places within the Pacific starting to come into Australia. And so the British citizens were really freaked out by this sudden influx of all these minority ethnic groups and wanted to put a stop to that. While the White Australia policy was passed a little bit after the Chinese Exclusion Acts, it was passed in 1901, it nonetheless is very similar. It limited the amount of immigrants that were entering Australia. Now, while it didn't explicitly exclude just the Chinese or just the Pacific Islanders, it essentially was meant for them because they were the primary migrants that were non-white coming into Australia. Okay? One of the things that the Chinese Exclusion Acts did was it made it difficult for Chinese to enter the United States. Britain had a similar policy. In order to make it difficult for immigrants to come into Australia, they had to pass a diction test, meaning that they had to prove that they could speak the British language. They could write in English. And if they couldn't, then they were not allowed entrance into Australia. What makes this a little unfair is that oftentimes most of these migrants didn't speak English. So it was nearly impossible for them to pass this type of a test because they didn't know the language. So it was kind of this foolproof way to keep these people out and preventing them from getting admittance into Australia. Here is a propaganda poster that was meant to target the Chinese people, that was designed and created by a British sketch artist. So this is definitely a British propaganda poster. So again, just like I did with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, I want you to think about, is this author in favor of or anti the Chinese coming? I think it's pretty obvious. But what you should also be thinking of is, again, that lit element. What is that symbolism? Why the octopus? What is the connotation that we tend to associate with an octopus? Also, again, consider any stereotypes. Okay? Are there any stereotypes about the Chinese that you can see here? Things for you to consider when looking at this propaganda and determining the point of view. A common lit element that I would like for you to consider when thinking about the White Australia policy is this idea of irony. Irony is often something pretty hard to see and to think about, but I want you to pay attention to this medallion and to think about irony when you look at it. Australia for the Australians. What in the world does that mean, and why is that ironic? You should think about who are true Australians. When did the British come? How did they come to Australia? And why is that a little ironic that this is the slogan on this medallion for the White Australia policy? Hopefully by now you can see the similarities between the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the White Australia policy. My hope is that you recognize that they are a result of the massive waves of immigration that were occurring, as well as increasing feelings of nationalism and pride in one's country and ethnic groups, but also that this form of racism also is tied to this industrial revolution, that this new wave of industry and job opportunities kind of lended itself to these massive waves of immigration, which is also why a lot of people tended to have these feelings of nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment. With that in mind, go back into the module and complete the Google form, and we will address this when we return together. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.